A young boy stumbles upon an abandoned baby, left alone in the cold with nothing but a thin blanket and a note. His heart races. Who would leave a helpless child like this? But when he finally uncovers the truth, the weight of it crushes him. This isn't just any baby. It's connected to him in ways he never could have imagined. And when he realizes why this child was left behind, the tears come fast and hard. Who does this baby belong to? What heartbreaking secret is hidden in its past? And how will this discovery change his life forever? Stay tuned for a powerful, life-altering story of fate, family, and redemption. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the empty police station as Walter Grayson sat at his desk, his weathered hands pressed against his temples. The clock on the wall showed midnight, but time had lost all meaning since Adam had stumbled back into his life 3 days ago, barefoot and wearing clothes that hung loose on his too thin frame. Dark circles under Adam's eyes had told a story of exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue, speaking of years of suffering Walter couldn't begin to comprehend. "This isn't right," Walter muttered to himself, staring at the scattered papers before him. His son barely spoke, flinched at every movement, and insisted his name was Caleb. The boy he'd lost 34 years ago was in there somewhere, but reaching him seemed impossible. Every attempt at conversation ended with Adam retreating further into himself, those haunted eyes darting toward the nearest exit. Even the smallest gestures, offering food, a gentle word, seemed to overwhelm him, as if kindness itself was foreign and frightening. Walter pulled up the original missing persons report on his computer. The yellowed paper copy lay beside his keyboard, its edges worn from years of handling, coffee stains marking countless late nights spent reviewing the details. April 15th, 1989, a normal Tuesday afternoon. Adam was supposed to wait at the school gates. Walter was running late, just 15 minutes late. But when he arrived, Adam was gone. The memory of that empty sidewalk still haunted his nightmares. He could still remember the panic rising in his throat as he'd searched the surrounding streets, calling Adam's name until his voice gave out. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up every scrap of information from that investigation. Witness statements, search patterns, dead ends. He'd memorized it all years ago. But something had to be different now. Something had to explain what had happened to his son. The same questions that had tortured him for decades took on new urgency with Adam sleeping fitfully in a safe house across town. Each click of the mouse felt like another attempt to bridge the impossible gap between then and now, between the laughing child he'd lost and the broken man who'd returned. "Think," he commanded himself, rubbing his tired eyes until spots danced in his vision. "Think like a cop, not a father." His police training warred with his paternal instincts, each fighting for control of his racing thoughts. Walter opened a new browser window and dove deeper. Missing children cases from the same period, similar disappearances, unusual religious groups in the area. Hours passed as he followed digital breadcrumbs, each search leading him further into darker corners of the internet. His coffee grew cold beside him, forgotten as the pieces started coming together. The pattern emerged slowly at first, then with frightening clarity, a shadow organization operating just beneath the surface of society. At 3 a.m. he found it. The website was buried deep, accessible only through specific channels. "The Path of Divine Obedience," the header read. Walter's heart pounded as he scrolled through carefully coded messages and veiled references. His police training helped him decode the sinister meaning behind the seemingly innocent words. Each paragraph revealed new horrors. Each image confirmed his worst fears. "No," he whispered, his throat tight as bile rose in his stomach. "Dear God, no." The group's doctrine unfolded before him in horrifying clarity. They believed in complete submission, in erasing individual identity to achieve perfect obedience. Children were considered ideal converts because they could be purified of their past lives. Each word he read matched another piece of Adam's broken behavior. The systematic way they broke down resistance, the careful steps to erase personality. It was all laid out like a terrible instruction manual for destroying souls. Walter's hands shook as he downloaded everything he could find. Training methods, conditioning techniques, behavior modification. The cult operated like a shadow, taking children and transforming them into blank slates they could reprogram. The clinical language they used made his skin crawl. Personality reconstruction and identity realignment were just prettied-up terms for systematic destruction of a person's soul. Each new document revealed another layer of calculated cruelty, another method of breaking down human will. 34 years, Walter growled, his voice breaking as tears burned behind his eyes. 34 years of this. The words felt like ashes in his mouth, each syllable a reminder of time lost, of suffering endured. A photo appeared on his screen, a compound hidden in the mountains surrounded by electric fences and guard towers disguised as observation posts. The timestamp showed it was taken just 2 years ago. Walter recognized the dead look in the eyes of the people in the image. It was the same empty stare Adam carried now, the same defeated slump to their shoulders. The similarities were undeniable, each face bearing the same marks of prolonged psychological torture. His coffee mug shattered against the wall before he even realized he'd thrown it. The sound echoed through the empty station, but Walter barely noticed. His vision blurred with tears of rage as the truth sank in. Drops fell onto the keyboard as his shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. The violence of his reaction surprised even him, but the pain and fury demanded release. They hadn't just taken his son. They had systematically destroyed him, piece by piece, year after year. They had erased Adam's memories, his personality, his very sense of self. They had turned a bright, curious 10-year-old boy who loved baseball and chocolate milk into a shell of a man who couldn't even look people in the eye. Every cherished memory of his son's childhood now stood in stark contrast to the broken man who had returned. Walter's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his desk. The wood creaked under his fingers, threatening to splinter. Every flinch, every moment of fear in Adam's eyes made sense now. Every time he'd called himself Caleb, every robotic response, every sign of conditioning, it all pointed to decades of systematic abuse and brainwashing. The pieces fit together into a picture so horrific it took his breath away. The scope of the abuse was beyond anything his years in law enforcement had prepared him for. "I'll tear them apart," Walter whispered, his voice deadly calm despite the fury coursing through him. "Every last one of them." The promise felt like a physical thing, heavy and real in the quiet station. He stared at his computer screen, at the evidence of 34 years of stolen life. His son hadn't just been missing all this time. He had been stolen, broken down, and rebuilt into someone else. They had taken everything from Adam, his childhood, his identity, his ability to trust, to love, to simply be himself. The weight of those lost years pressed down on Walter's shoulders like a physical burden. Each moment of joy they'd stolen, each smile they'd erased fueled his determination. Walter's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This was something far darker, far more horrifying than he'd ever imagined. The rage building inside him was unlike anything he'd felt in his decades of police work. This was personal, primal, and it demanded justice. His fingers hovered over the keypad as he prepared to make the calls that would set everything in motion, knowing that from this moment on nothing would be the same. The interrogation room felt smaller at 12:30 a.m., its stark walls closing in as Walter pushed open the heavy door. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the institutional gray floor. His steps were measured now, controlled, unlike his earlier emotional exit. The manila folder in his hands held 30 years of memories reduced to paper and ink, its edges worn from years of handling, the corners soft and frayed from countless nights of review. Adam sat exactly as before, straight-backed and rigid, hands placed symmetrically on the metal table. His eyes focused on some distant point beyond the wall. His breathing so shallow he barely seemed alive. His prison-issued clothes hung loose on his frame, the orange fabric making his pale skin look sickly under the harsh lighting. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, evidence of sleepless nights that Walter could only imagine. He hadn't moved an inch in the hour Walter had been gone, like a statue carved from flesh and bone. "I'd like to show you something," Walter said softly, pulling out the chair across from Adam. The metal legs scraped against the floor, the sound echoing in the silent room like nails on concrete. But Adam didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just waited, the way Walter imagined he'd been trained to do, like a soldier awaiting orders, empty and obedient. Walter opened the folder with deliberate care, the paper crackling under his fingers like autumn leaves. The first photo showed a grinning 10-year-old boy in a Little League uniform, bat slung over his shoulder, his face dirty but triumphant. The red jersey was slightly too big, hanging off one shoulder. "This was your first home run," Walter said, his voice gentle. "You were so excited. You ran the bases twice. The whole team carried you on their shoulders afterward. Coach Jenkins said he'd never seen anyone so happy." He placed the photo on the table between them, sliding it forward with trembling fingers. Adam's expression remained blank, his eyes never moving to the picture, his face a carefully constructed mask of indifference. His hands stayed perfectly still on the table, not even a finger twitching toward the memory laid before him. Walter pulled out another photo, a golden retriever with a red bandana, tongue lolling out in a happy dog smile, laying in a patch of sunlight on their old porch. "This was Rusty. You picked him out yourself at the shelter. Said he had the kindest eyes you'd ever seen. He used to sleep at the foot of your bed every night." The photo joined the first one. "Remember how he'd steal your socks? Drive your mother crazy leaving them all over the yard? That dog loved you something fierce, wouldn't eat for days after you disappeared." Nothing. Not even a flicker. Just the steady rise and fall of his chest, mechanical and precise, like a clock ticking away empty seconds. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he continued, his wedding ring catching the harsh light, throwing tiny reflections against the wall. "Every Saturday we'd play catch in the backyard. You had this trick pitch. Used to get me every time." He forced a small laugh, trying to keep his voice steady, fighting against the thickness in his throat. "You'd pretend to throw right, then switch to left at the last second. Nearly gave me whiplash. You were always so proud of fooling your old man. Called yourself the master of deception." Adam's fingers twitched, so slight it could have been a trick of the fluorescent lighting, a mere shadow of movement. But Walter saw it, that tiny betrayal of the perfect stillness, and his heart jumped, hope flaring like a match in darkness, desperate for fuel. "And this," Walter said, his voice softening as he pulled out the next photo, handling it with reverence, as if it might crumble at his touch. "This is your mother." The picture showed a woman with Adam's same dark hair, her arms wrapped around a young Adam as they both laughed at something off camera, their joy frozen in time. The kitchen counter behind them was dusted with flour, a plate of cookies visible at the edge of the frame. "She made the best chocolate chip cookies. You'd try to sneak them before dinner, but she always caught you with crumbs on your shirt. Said you were the worst cookie thief in history, called you her little chocolate bandit." Adam's right hand moved a fraction of an inch, then stopped, as if caught in an act of rebellion. His breathing quickened almost imperceptibly, his chest rising and falling just a bit faster, like a runner trying to hide his exhaustion. Walter leaned forward, hope rising in his chest, the chair creaking beneath him like old bones settling. "Son, I know you're in there. I know they tried to erase everything, but they couldn't. Not completely. These memories are still part of you. They're written in your bones, in every cell of your body. No one can take that away." The change was subtle but immediate. Adam's shoulders stiffened further, his jaw clenched tight enough to strain the muscles in his neck. The tiny signs of recognition vanished behind an impenetrable wall, like shutters slamming closed against a storm, leaving only emptiness behind. "You're wrong." Adam's voice was flat, emotionless, barely above a whisper, each word precise and measured like stones dropped into still water. His first words in hours fell heavy in the quiet room. "I was never your son." Walter's throat tightened, a physical pain spreading through his chest like ice crystallizing in his veins. The hope that had been building crashed down around him, leaving only emptiness in its wake, a void as vast as the years between them. His son sat right there, close enough to touch, but somehow further away than ever, separated by walls thicker than the concrete surrounding them. Walls built of stolen memories and carefully crafted lies. The photos lay between them on the cold metal table, bridges to a past that Adam refused to cross. Moments of joy turned to silent accusations in the harsh interrogation room light. Each image seemed to mock Walter's efforts, reminding him of everything that had been taken, everything that might never return. The holding cell's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Adam's face as he sat motionless on the thin cot. His fingers traced invisible patterns on his thighs, a nervous habit he didn't remember developing. The concrete walls seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, memories trying to break through barriers built over decades. Every few seconds, a distant door would slam somewhere in the building, making him twitch involuntarily. The metallic taste of fear lingered in his mouth, familiar yet somehow different from what he'd known before. Officer Dan Parker's keys jingled as he approached with a paper bag. "Brought you some food," he said, his voice echoing in the empty corridor. The lock clicked, and the cell door creaked open. The smell of cheap hamburger and fries wafted through the air, mixing with the antiseptic scent that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. Adam's muscles tensed imperceptibly. Years of training kicked in, assessing exits, calculating distances, timing movements. His breathing remained steady, giving nothing away as Officer Parker stepped inside. His mind cataloged every detail. The officer's relaxed posture, the slight limp in his left leg, the radio clipped to his belt. He noted the way Parker's weight shifted, how his guard was down, treating this like any other routine task. In one fluid motion, Adam was up. His shoulder connected with Parker's chest, sending the young officer stumbling backward. The paper bag hit the floor with a soft thud as Adam slipped past, his bare feet silent on the cold tiles. Grease stained the paper where it landed, spreading like a dark constellation against the brown surface. "Hey, stop!" Parker's shout echoed through the hallway, followed by the crackle of his radio coming to life. The sound of running footsteps joined the chaos, growing louder from multiple directions. Adam ran with mechanical precision, each movement efficient and purposeful. Left turn, right turn, emergency exit. His mind might be confused, but his body remembered every drill, every escape route he'd been forced to memorize. The emergency lights cast an eerie red glow over everything, making the hallways seem endless. His heartbeat drummed in perfect rhythm with his footfalls, a synchronized dance of survival. The night air hit his skin like needles. His thin cotton clothes offered little protection against the February chill, but he didn't slow down. Streetlights blurred past as he darted between shadows, letting muscle memory guide him through unfamiliar territory. The moon hung low and full, casting stark shadows across his path. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound echoing off brick walls. Walter's coffee cup shattered on his office floor when the call came through, dark liquid seeping into the worn carpet. "What do you mean he's gone?" He was already moving, grabbing his jacket. "Lock down the building, I'm going after him." His chair toppled backward in his haste, the sound of it hitting the floor lost in the sudden surge of adrenaline. The streets were empty at this hour, his footsteps echoing off brick walls as he pursued the ghostly figure ahead. Adam weaved through alleyways, but his movements were becoming less coordinated. 30 years of malnutrition and confinement were catching up to him. His bare feet left faint bloody marks on the concrete, each step becoming more labored than the last. "Adam!" Walter's voice bounced off the buildings. "Please stop!" The desperation in his tone carried through the night air, heavy with decades of regret and longing. Adam's legs gave out near Thompson Street. He stumbled, caught himself against a wall, then collapsed behind a rusty dumpster. His breathing came in sharp gasps, his whole body trembling, from cold, from exhaustion, from the weight of competing realities in his mind. Steam rose from his sweat-soaked clothes in the frigid air. The rough brick wall scraped against his back, grounding him in the moment. Walter rounded the corner, his own breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He found Adam curled into himself, arms wrapped around his knees, rocking slightly. The sight broke something in Walter's chest, A nearby streetlight flickered, casting intermittent shadows over them both, making the scene feel surreal and dreamlike. Instead of reaching for his handcuffs, Walter slowly removed his jacket. "You're freezing," he said softly, draping it over Adam's shoulders. "Let me help you up. We're not going back to the station." The leather was still warm from Walter's body, carrying with it a faint scent of coffee and aftershave. Adam flinched at the touch but didn't resist as Walter helped him to his feet. "I'm taking you home," Walter said, his voice rough with emotion. "No more cells, no more questions, just home." A distant siren wailed, making Adam tense, but Walter's steady presence kept him from bolting again. The promise in those words hung between them, fragile but real. Together, they walked toward Walter's car, leaving the cold alley behind. Adam's bare feet made no sound on the pavement, while Walter's steps echoed like a heartbeat in the pre-dawn silence. The first hints of sunrise were just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of purple and gray, a new day breaking over their shared brokenness. The old truck's engine rumbled through the darkness, its headlights cutting through the dense fog that had settled over the country roads like a thick blanket. Walter's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he navigated the familiar turns, each one bringing them closer to home. His jaw clenched and unclenched rhythmically with tension, a habit he'd developed over years of stress. In the passenger seat, Adam sat perfectly still, his back straight as a board, hands folded in his lap like a statue, looking more like a mannequin than a living person. The truck's heater whirred softly, fighting against the early morning chill that seeped through the old vehicle's frame. Patches of rust around the vents rattled with each bump in the road. Every few minutes, Walter would steal a glance at his son, searching for any sign of recognition or emotion in that carefully blank face. But Adam's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, watching the trees pass by in an endless parade of shadows, his breathing so shallow it was barely visible. After 20 minutes of silence that felt like hours, Walter turned onto the gravel driveway that led to his house. The familiar crunch of stones under the tires brought a lump to his throat that he couldn't swallow away. How many times had he made this drive alone, wondering if Adam would ever come home? The memory of all those empty returns made his chest ache, each one a reminder of his failure. The house emerged from the darkness, a two-story farmhouse with peeling white paint and dark windows, its weathered facade a testament to passing years. Walter hadn't changed a thing since that day 30 years ago, as if keeping everything the same might somehow bring back what was lost. Even the tire swing still hung from the old oak tree, now weathered and gray with age, creaking softly in the night breeze. The porch light flickered weakly, casting uncertain shadows across the yard. He parked the truck and cut the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy between them, thick with unspoken words and buried memories. "We're here," Walter said softly, though it wasn't necessary. Adam didn't respond, but his fingers tightened slightly in his lap, knuckles turning white with tension. A moth fluttered against the windshield, drawn to the dim dashboard lights. They walked to the front door, their footsteps echoing on the wooden porch like drum beats in the quiet night. When Walter flicked on the hallway light, the house seemed to wake from a long sleep, yellow warmth spilling across worn floorboards that creaked beneath their feet. Family photos lined the walls. Birthdays, baseball games, fishing trips. Moments frozen in time from before everything changed, each one a reminder of what had been stolen. Dust motes danced in the light, stirred by their movement. Adam stopped abruptly in the middle of the hallway, his body going rigid. His eyes locked onto a particular photograph, a 10-year-old boy with a gap-toothed grin, holding up a trophy at a Little League game, joy radiating from his young face. Walter watched as something flickered across Adam's face, a crack in that carefully maintained mask, a flash of confusion and pain. But just as quickly, Adam turned away, his jaw clenching so tight Walter could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Walter cleared his throat, fighting back the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. His hands trembled slightly as he shoved them into his pockets. "The spare room's upstairs," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "First door on the right. There are clean towels in the bathroom if you want a shower." He gestured vaguely toward the stairs, careful not to make any sudden movements, treating Adam like a spooked animal that might bolt at any moment. Adam stood motionless, his eyes now fixed on the floor, shoulders hunched slightly as if carrying an invisible weight. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, filled with 3 decades of loss. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the seconds, each one echoing in the stillness. As Walter turned to head downstairs, giving his son the space he clearly needed, Adam's voice stopped him. It was barely more than a whisper, rough from disuse, trembling with uncertainty, and something that might have been fear. The words seemed to cost him tremendous effort. "Why are you doing this?" Walter's heart clenched painfully in his chest, the question hitting him like a physical blow. He turned back slowly, meeting Adam's confused, almost suspicious gaze. The answer was simple, even if nothing else was. It was the one truth he'd held onto all these years through every dark night and empty morning. "Because you're my son." Lightning flashed through the window, casting stark shadows across the unfamiliar bedroom. Adam lay rigid on the bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, counting the seconds until the thunder would follow. His hands gripped the sheets, though he forced them to remain still, a habit drilled into him through years of conditioning. Every muscle in his body remained tense, ready to respond to commands that weren't coming anymore. The emptiness of those missing orders echoed in his mind like a constant haunting silence. The room felt wrong, too soft, too quiet, too safe. The bed beneath him was nothing like the hard cots he'd grown used to. The air smelled of old wood and something else, something that made his chest tight. Pine, maybe. Or was it cedar? The scent triggered something in him he couldn't quite grasp, like trying to hold on to smoke with bare hands. Every breath of it made his heart flutter with an unnamed recognition. Another flash lit up the room. 1, 2, 3. The thunder crashed overhead, and Adam's body jerked involuntarily. His breath caught in his throat as something burst in his mind, a memory, sharp and clear as broken glass. The force of it made him dizzy, like the ground had dropped away beneath him, leaving him floating in a sea of forgotten moments. He was small, so small, wrapped in warm arms that smelled of leather and coffee. Thunder boomed outside, but the arms held him tight. "I've got you, buddy," a deep voice rumbled. Walter's voice, younger but unmistakable. "Your old dad's got you." The words echoed through time, carrying a warmth he'd forgotten could exist, melting something frozen deep within his chest. Adam's hands began to shake. The memory felt real, too real to be another implanted story. He could feel the scratch of Walter's uniform against his cheek, hear the steady thump of his heart. His throat closed up as more fragments surfaced, sitting on broad shoulders, small hands gripping dark hair, laughter echoing in his ears. Each image hit him like a physical blow, threatening to crack the walls he'd built around himself. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as the memories assaulted him, each one more vivid than the last. The floor creaked in the hallway. Adam instantly stilled his breathing, but his heart hammered against his ribs, so loud he was sure it could be heard through the walls. The door opened slowly, and Walter's silhouette appeared in the doorway, a darker shadow against the darkness, familiar yet strange. "You okay in here?" Walter's voice was quiet, careful. The concern in it made something twist painfully in Adam's chest, like a key turning in a long rusted lock. Adam didn't respond, but his rigid posture gave him away. Another crack of thunder made him flinch, and Walter moved into the room, settling his weight carefully on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped slightly under his presence, and Adam fought the urge to pull away, his muscles coiled tight with tension and uncertainty. "You were afraid of storms," Walter murmured, his voice rough with memory. "Used to climb into our bed every time. Your mother would make hot chocolate, and we'd tell stories until you fell asleep." His words carried the weight of countless stormy nights, each one now lost to time. Adam shook his head automatically, a denial born of years of training. But something deep inside him recognized the truth in those words. He could almost feel phantom arms around him, smell that familiar scent of leather and coffee, hear that steady heartbeat. The memory of hot chocolate ghosted across his tongue, sweet and warm and safe, bringing with it a flood of sensations he'd been taught to forget. His breathing grew ragged as he fought against the conflicting realities in his mind. The cult's teachings screamed at him to reject these memories, but they felt more real than anything he'd been forced to believe for the past 30 years. Each breath became a battle between what he'd been taught to believe and what his heart knew to be true, leaving him trembling with the effort of containing both truths. Walter remained still beside him, a solid presence in the storm-lit darkness. He didn't reach out, didn't push, just sat there, grounding Adam as his world tilted on its axis. The silence between them filled with unspoken words and 30 years of lost moments, heavy with the weight of everything they couldn't say and everything they needed to. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow across the worn wooden table. Walter stood at the stove, methodically flipping eggs and keeping one eye on Adam, who sat stiffly in his chair, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. The familiar sizzle of bacon and the rich aroma of coffee filled the air, creating an illusion of normalcy that felt painfully forced. Steam rose from the pan in delicate wisps, dancing in the golden light. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each uncomfortable moment. "You used to love your eggs scrambled," Walter said softly, sliding a plate in front of Adam. "With cheese melted on top. Extra sharp cheddar was your favorite. You'd always ask for seconds, even when you were too full to finish them." Adam's hands hovered over the plate, trembling slightly. His fingers twitched, caught between reaching for the fork and pulling away. The food smelled different from what he was used to, richer, more complex than the bland meals he'd known for so long. A piece of bacon curled at the edge of the plate, its aroma both enticing and overwhelming. A drop of grease glistened on the crispy surface. Walter sat down across from him, trying to keep his movements casual despite the heavy tension in the room. His coffee cup clinked against the saucer as he set it down, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. "You know, when you were little, you'd always steal bacon off my plate when you thought I wasn't looking. You'd wait until I was reading the newspaper, then sneak your little hand over. Sometimes I'd pretend not to notice just to see that mischievous grin on your face." Adam's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the untouched food before him. A muscle twitched in his cheek, and his fingers drummed nervously against the edge of the table. Encouraged by the subtle reaction, Walter stood up and walked to the living room, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, a familiar sound that spoke of years lived in this home. "I want to show you something," he said, returning with an old DVD player and a worn case, its edges frayed from years of handling. "I've kept this all these years, never could bring myself to pack it away. It's been right here in the drawer, waiting." The TV clicked on with a soft hum, and suddenly the room filled with the sounds of children laughing. On screen, a small boy with tousled brown hair sat before a birthday cake, his face lit up with pure joy. The cake was covered in blue frosting with wobbly letters spelling out "Happy Birthday, Adam." Colorful balloons bobbed in the background, and party streamers decorated the walls. "Make a wish, Adam," Walter's voice called from behind the camera. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, then blew out all 10 candles in one breath. Everyone cheered. Adam's breathing became shallow, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table, the wood creaking under his grip. Beads of sweat formed on his upper lip, and his left leg bounced uncontrollably under the table. "That was your 10th birthday," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just 3 days before." He trailed off, watching Adam's face intently, searching for any sign of recognition in those haunted eyes. The morning light caught the silver in Walter's hair, highlighting the years that had passed since that happy day. The boy on screen smashed his face into the cake, emerging with frosting everywhere, giggling uncontrollably. Blue icing covered his nose and cheeks, creating a mask of childhood joy. Walter's deep laugh echoed through the speakers, joined by the voices of long-ago party guests. The camera shook slightly with his laughter. Something inside Adam snapped. He shot to his feet, the chair crashing backward onto the floor with a thunderous clatter. The sudden movement sent his untouched fork clattering across the table. "I never belonged to you," he screamed, his voice raw and broken. the words tearing from his throat like shards of glass. His whole body shook with rage and confusion, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. Sweat beaded on his forehead and his chest heaved with each ragged breath. Walter reached out instinctively, but Adam recoiled as if burned, stumbling backward until he hit the counter. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away from the table, from Walter, from the laughing child on the screen who wore his face but couldn't possibly be him. The morning sunlight caught the tears now freely falling down his cheeks, making them glisten like broken glass. Before Walter could say another word, Adam turned and fled, knocking over a stack of mail on his way out. The front door slammed so hard the windows rattled, leaving behind a deafening silence broken only by the continued laughter from the TV. The forgotten breakfast grew cold on the table, steam no longer rising from the carefully prepared eggs. Walter stood frozen, watching through the window as Adam disappeared down the street, his figure growing smaller until he vanished around the corner. This time, he didn't follow. He knew he'd pushed too hard, too fast. The home video continued to play behind him, a cruel reminder of everything that had been stolen from them both. On screen, the happy family celebrated, oblivious to the tragedy that would soon tear their world apart. A paper napkin fluttered to the floor, disturbed by the lingering breeze from Adam's desperate exit. The living room felt like a tomb, the air thick with an oppressive silence that seemed to seep into every corner. Walter, slumped in his old leather recliner, stared at the empty space around him, his hands pressed against his face in a futile attempt to hold back the crushing wave of despair that threatened to consume him. The faint ticking of the wall clock only emphasized the emptiness, marking each moment of his failure. The house creaked and groaned as if accusing him of his failures. Morning light filtered through the dusty windows, casting a somber glow on the untouched photos lining the walls, frozen moments of a life that now felt more like a distant dream. Walter's eyes drifted to a picture of Adam, a gap-toothed grin lighting up his 7-year-old face as he proudly held up a trophy from his first Little League game. His small fingers were wrapped so tightly around that plastic baseball player as if he'd never let it go. "I'm such a fool," Walter whispered, his voice cracking with the admission. He had been trying to force Adam back into that carefree childhood, expecting him to simply step back into a life that had been so violently ripped away. The memory of his ex-wife Margaret's words hit him like a physical blow. She had stood in this very room, boxes packed by the door, shaking her head at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resignation. "You hold on to ghosts, Walter. That boy needs love, not memories." She had been right. All these years later, he was still doing it, clutching desperately at the past instead of seeing the broken man in front of him. Adam didn't need childhood photos and old baseball trophies. He needed patience, understanding, and the space to find himself again. The dusty shelves of memorabilia suddenly felt like a mockery of everything they'd lost. Walter's shoulders sagged as the truth settled over him. Maybe he had pushed too hard. Maybe he had already lost his son for good this time. The thought made his chest ache with a familiar, hollow pain that seemed to grow deeper with each passing day. The silence in the house pressed in around him, heavy with regret. Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the windows in a gentle rhythm that reminded him of summers long ago, when Adam would splash through puddles without a care in the world. Walter closed his eyes, listening to the sound and wondering if this was how it would end, not with the triumph of finding his son, but with the quiet death of hope. Then, cutting through the rain and silence, came a soft knock at the front door. Walter's heart jumped. He pushed himself up from the recliner, his joints protesting the sudden movement. His hands trembled slightly as he crossed the room. When he pulled open the door, his breath caught in his throat. Adam stood on the porch, soaked from the rain. Water dripped from his hair, running down his face like tears, his clothes clinging to his thin frame. But it was his eyes that made Walter freeze. They were different now, filled with something other than fear or anger. There was a glimmer of recognition, maybe even trust. This time he didn't turn away. This time he stayed, his shoulders squared against the storm behind him. The drizzle fell softly on Walter's front porch, creating a gentle rhythm against the wooden boards. Adam stood there, his clothes damp from the rain, his shoulders tense but not as rigid as before. His eyes darted between Walter and the ground, like a wounded animal unsure whether to trust or flee. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the exhaustion etched in every line, the dark circles under his eyes speaking of countless sleepless nights. Walter stayed in the doorway, careful not to make any sudden movements. The morning's disaster had taught him something crucial. Pushing wouldn't work, not with Adam, not after everything. The memory of his son's panic was still too fresh, too raw, the way he'd backed into a corner with his hands raised defensively still burning in Walter's mind. "You must be hungry," Walter said simply, his voice quiet and steady. He kept his hands visible, hanging loose at his sides, remembering how Adam had flinched earlier when he'd reached out too quickly. Adam's fingers twitched at his sides, his worn shoes shifting slightly on the wet wood of the porch. For a moment, Walter thought he might run again, disappear into the rain and shadows like a ghost. But then came a small nod, barely noticeable but definitely there. A tiny victory that made Walter's heart clench with equal parts hope and sorrow. In the kitchen, Walter moved with deliberate slowness, making sandwiches without any fuss. No stories this time, no memories, just bread, turkey, lettuce, and cheese. The simple routine of preparing food gave his trembling hands something to do, helped steady the nervous energy coursing through him. He could feel Adam watching his every move from the doorway, tracking him like someone who'd learned the hard way to never let their guard down, his body angled slightly toward the nearest exit. They sat at the kitchen table, the only sound being the soft patter of rain against the windows and the quiet crunch of lettuce. Walter focused on his own plate, fighting every instinct to stare at his son, to search for signs of recognition. The old wooden chair creaked underneath him as he shifted his weight, the familiar sound echoing in the heavy silence between them. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't as heavy as before. Adam took small, careful bites, his movements measured and controlled, like everything else about him. But his shoulders had dropped slightly, the tension easing just a fraction. He held the sandwich like something precious, each bite deliberate and conscious, as if he was used to making every morsel last. Minutes passed. Walter had almost finished his sandwich when Adam's voice broke the quiet, startling them both, the unexpected sound making them both jump slightly. "Tell me about him." Walter looked up, confused by the strange request. Adam's hands were pressed flat against the table, his eyes fixed on his half-eaten sandwich. His knuckles were white with pressure, as if he needed to anchor himself to something solid, something real in this moment that felt both terrifying and necessary. "About Adam," he clarified, the name coming out like it belonged to someone else, someone distant and unknown. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but the words were clear. A slight tremor ran through his hands, making the table vibrate almost imperceptibly beneath his palms. Walter's heart hammered in his chest, the sound so loud he was sure Adam must hear it. This was different from the morning's forced memories and desperate attempts. This was Adam asking, choosing to know. The weight of the moment settled around them like a physical thing, making the air feel thick and heavy with possibility. Setting down his sandwich, Walter took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He didn't reach for photos this time. He didn't try to make eye contact. Instead, he just started speaking, his voice soft and steady, matching the rhythm of the rain outside, letting the words flow as naturally as the water running down the window panes. Adam was a curious kid, he began, keeping his tone casual, like he was telling a story about someone else, someone safe to discuss. Always taking things apart to see how they worked. Once he dismantled his mother's alarm clock, spent 3 days trying to put it back together. Never did get it working quite right again, but he was so proud of trying. She kept that broken clock for years just because he'd worked so hard on it. Adam's fingers twitched on the table, but he didn't move away. He just listened, his breathing steady but shallow, as Walter continued to share pieces of a life that had been stolen away. The sandwich lay forgotten on his plate, all his focus on the words floating between them, each one landing like a stone in still water, creating ripples of possibility. For the first time since finding him, Walter saw something new in Adam's posture. Not just fear or resistance, but something else. Something that looked almost like want to know, want to understand. It was there in the slight forward tilt of his body, the way his eyes had stopped darting toward the exits, the almost imperceptible lean toward Walter's words. His hands remained pressed against the table, but their trembling had lessened as if the stories were somehow anchoring him to the present moment. And so Walter kept talking, careful to keep his voice even, letting the stories flow naturally, each one chosen with care. He wasn't trying to force Adam to remember anymore. He was just answering his son's question, one small truth at a time, building a bridge across the chasm between them word by word. The rain continued its gentle percussion on the windows, providing a soothing backdrop to this fragile moment of connection, this first tentative step toward understanding. The living room was bathed in the warm glow of the fireplace, shadows dancing on the walls as night settled in. Walter glanced at Adam, who sat quietly on the couch after hours of careful conversation. His son's face was illuminated by the flickering flames, highlighting the tension in his jaw and the slight tremor in his hands that he tried to hide. Something in Walter's gut told him it was time. "Wait here," Walter said softly, rising from his chair. His footsteps creaked on the old wooden stairs as he climbed to the attic, each step heavy with anticipation. The musty scent of stored memories grew stronger as he reached the top. Adam watched the flames flicker, his mind still a jumble of half-formed memories and doubts. The fire's warmth couldn't reach the cold uncertainty inside him. His shoulders hunched forward protectively as he heard Walter rummaging above, then returning footsteps. Walter appeared holding something in his hands, an old cassette player, covered in a thin layer of dust, its silver buttons worn from years of use. A few scratches marked its plastic case, each one a testament to its age. "I've kept this," Walter said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your mother. She used to sing you to sleep every night." His fingers trembled slightly as he placed the player on the coffee table, treating it like a precious artifact. The old wood creaked beneath its weight. Adam stared at it, his face unreadable, but his eyes never left the device. The muscles in his throat worked as he swallowed hard. Walter pressed the play button, and for a moment, there was only static. Then a voice filled the room, gentle, warm, full of love. A woman singing a lullaby, her voice clear despite the tape's age, carrying the same tenderness it had 3 decades ago. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." Adam's entire body went rigid. His hands gripped the edge of the couch, knuckles turning white, fingernails digging into the fabric. Small indentations formed where his fingers pressed. The voice continued to sing soft and sweet, floating through the air like a ghost from the past, wrapping around him like an embrace he'd forgotten he needed. The crackling of the fire seemed to fade away, leaving only the melody. His breathing became uneven, catching in his throat. A single tear escaped, rolling down his cheek, leaving a glistening trail in the firelight. More followed, as the memories crashed through the walls in his mind. The scent of lavender on his mother's skin, the way she would brush his hair back from his forehead, her arms holding him close as she sang him to sleep every night. Each note unlocked another precious memory he thought had been lost forever, pieces of his childhood returning like water breaking through a dam. "Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." Adam's lips moved silently with the words, muscle memory taking over. His shoulders began to shake as more tears fell, streaming down his face unchecked. The voice on the tape was undeniable. It reached past all the programming, all the lies, straight into his core, awakening something that had been buried but never truly gone. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably. "Mom?" The word came out choked, barely a whisper, filled with 3 decades of longing. It was the first time he'd said it in 30 years, and the sound seemed to surprise even him. Walter watched as his son's carefully constructed walls crumbled. Adam's face crumpled, and suddenly he was moving, falling forward into Walter's arms. His whole body shook with deep, racking sobs as he clutched at his father's shirt, holding on as if afraid he might disappear. The fabric bunched between his fingers as years of suppressed emotion poured out. Walter held him tight, his own tears falling as he whispered, "It's okay, son. You're home." He rocked slightly, the way he used to when Adam was small, one hand cradling the back of his son's head. The familiar motion came naturally, as if no time had passed at all. The lullaby played on in the background as father and son clung to each other, decades of loss and pain pouring out in the firelight. The tape crackled softly, a mother's love bridging the years between then and now, helping to heal what had been broken. Outside, snow began to fall, adding its gentle silence to the sacred moment of reunion. The living room was bathed in the warm glow of the fireplace, shadows dancing on the walls as night settled in. Walter glanced at Adam, who sat quietly on the couch after hours of careful conversation. Something in Walter's gut told him it was time to share a piece of the past he'd been holding on to for decades. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical thing, making each breath feel heavy with anticipation. "Wait here," Walter said softly, rising from his chair. His footsteps creaked on the old wooden stairs as he climbed to the attic, each step echoing the weight of years gone by. The familiar musty scent of stored memories greeted him as he reached the top. In the dusty space above, Walter's hands found the small box he'd kept all these years, tucked away like a secret treasure. His fingers traced the worn edges before lifting the lid. Inside lay the cassette player, preserved like a precious relic of a time long past. He held it carefully, like it might crumble in his hands, and made his way back downstairs, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. The stairs seemed longer on the way down, each step bringing him closer to a moment he'd both longed for and feared. Adam watched the flames flicker, his mind still a jumble of half-formed memories and doubts. The fire cast a soft light on his face, highlighting the lines of confusion and pain etched there. His shoulders were tense, hands clasped tightly in his lap as if trying to anchor himself to reality. Walter sat down beside him, placing the old player on the coffee table. The plastic was yellowed with age, but Walter knew the tape inside was still good. He'd played it countless times over the years just to hear her voice again, to remind himself of the love that once filled their home. Each time had been both a comfort and a reminder of all they'd lost. "Your mother," Walter said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She used to sing to you every night. It was her special way of saying goodnight, of making sure you knew you were loved." His words hung in the air between them, fragile as spun glass. His finger hovered over the play button for a moment before pressing down. The tape crackled to life, and then a voice, clear and sweet, floating through the air like a ghost becoming real. The melody was soft and gentle, a lullaby filled with all the love a mother could give. The sound quality wasn't perfect, marked by the slight hiss of aged tape, but the warmth and tenderness in her voice came through crystal clear. "Sleep tight, my little angel." Adam's entire body went rigid. His hands gripped the edge of the couch, knuckles turning white as the color drained from his face. The soft melody continued, a mother's love captured in time, and Adam's breathing became uneven, shallow. Each note seemed to strike a chord deep within him, resonating with a truth he'd been denied for so long. His eyes widened, fixed on some distant point, as if seeing through the walls of the present into the past. The lullaby filled the room, and with it came the memories, overwhelming, undeniable. The scent of lavender from his mother's perfume filled his senses, so vivid he could almost taste it on his tongue. Warm arms holding him close, making him feel safe and cherished. Soft kisses on his forehead, each one a promise of love. Bedtime stories and nighttime prayers, whispered in the dark, creating a bond that even time couldn't break. A childhood routine he'd been forced to forget came rushing back, sweeping away the lies he'd been told. The memories hit him like waves, each one stronger than the last. A single tear rolled down Adam's cheek, then another. His lips trembled as he whispered a word he hadn't spoken in decades, a word that held a world of longing and loss. "Mom?" The word came out broken, barely audible, but it carried the weight of 30 years of silence. The dam broke. More memories flooded in. Christmas mornings filled with laughter and joy, birthday cakes with candles glowing bright, skinned knees kissed better by loving hands. His mother's laugh, her smile, the way she'd dance while making breakfast, turning even the simplest moments into something magical. The smell of chocolate chip cookies baking on Sunday afternoons, the sound of her humming while she worked in the garden, the feel of her hand smoothing his hair back from his forehead when he was sick. All the pieces of himself he'd been told were lies suddenly crystallized into truth, each one a part of the puzzle that made him who he was. Adam's body began to shake. The careful walls built by years of conditioning crumbled away, leaving him raw and exposed. A sob tore from his throat, not the controlled crying he'd been allowed in the cult, but deep, gut-wrenching grief. It was the cry of a man reclaiming his past, of a boy who'd lost his way, finally finding his path home. The sound echoed off the walls, primal and honest, filled with both pain and release. He turned to Walter, no longer seeing a stranger or a threat but his father. His dad. The man who'd chased him around the backyard, taught him to ride a bike, coached his little league team. The man who'd stayed up all night when Adam had the flu, who'd built him a treehouse with his own hands, who'd taught him how to throw a perfect spiral. The man who'd loved him unconditionally, who'd never given up hope that one day his son would return. Every fishing trip, every bedtime story, every proud smile at a good report card, it all came back in a rush of emotion and certainty. Adam collapsed forward, falling into Walter's arms. His fingers clutched at his father's shirt as years of suppressed emotion poured out, leaving wet spots on the fabric. Walter held him tight, his own tears falling freely now. In that moment, they were not just two men reunited by fate, but a family reborn, their bond stronger than ever. The years of separation seemed to melt away in the warmth of their embrace, healing what had been broken. "It's okay, son," Walter whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're home. You're finally home." His hands trembled as he held his boy, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. The lullaby played on, a gentle backdrop to their reunion, as father and son began the long journey of putting their family back together. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting warm patches of light across the worn linoleum floor. Walter stood at the stove, methodically flipping strips of bacon that sizzled and popped in the pan. The rich aroma of coffee mixed with the smoky scent of cooking meat, filling the house with an almost forgotten sense of home. He'd been up since dawn, unable to sleep, his mind churning with memories of countless mornings just like this one from 30 years ago. He heard the soft footsteps before he saw Adam. His son lingered in the doorway, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes darting around the kitchen as if searching for hidden dangers. But something was different this morning. The rigid tension that had defined his posture was softer somehow, replaced by an awkward uncertainty. His hair was slightly mussed from sleep, making him look younger, more vulnerable. Walter kept his movements slow and predictable, not wanting to startle him. "Morning," he said quietly, keeping his eyes on the bacon. "Coffee's ready if you want some." He gestured toward the fresh pot with his spatula, careful to make the movement gentle and casual. Adam took a tentative step into the kitchen, then another. He stood there, hands hanging loosely at his sides, watching Walter cook with an expression that seemed caught between curiosity and confusion. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, as if fighting the urge to wrap around themselves in his usual defensive gesture. Walter pulled 2 plates from the cabinet and divided up the bacon, adding some scrambled eggs he'd kept warm on the back burner. He'd seasoned them lightly with salt and pepper, remembering how Adam used to love his eggs as a child. He set 1 plate on the table, gesturing for Adam to sit. The chair scraped softly against the floor as Adam lowered himself into it. He stared at the food, his brow furrowed slightly. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the quiet tick of the wall clock and the occasional pop from the cooling pan. Finally, Adam's voice, barely above a whisper, broke it. "I don't remember if I like bacon." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all they represented. 30 years of lost memories, of stolen choices, of a life interrupted. Walter felt his heart squeeze, but he kept his voice light, fighting back the surge of anger at those who had taken even these simple pleasures from his son. "Then try it," he said, offering a small smile. "Find out." He pushed the salt and pepper shakers closer, giving Adam the option to season his food as he wished. Adam's eyes flickered up to meet Walter's for just a moment before returning to the plate. His hand moved slowly toward the fork, fingers wrapping around it with deliberate care. The tines pierced a piece of bacon, and he lifted it with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb. A small crease appeared between his eyebrows as he studied the crispy strip. Walter pretended to focus on his own breakfast, but he watched from the corner of his eye as Adam took that first bite. For a moment, his son just sat there, processing the taste and texture as if cataloging every sensation. His jaw moved slowly, thoughtfully, like he was solving a complex puzzle. Then Adam looked up, meeting Walter's gaze directly. "It's good," he said softly, and something in Walter's chest loosened at those two simple words. Because it wasn't just about the bacon. It was about Adam making his first real choice in decades, forming his own opinion, expressing his own preference. A hint of color touched his cheeks, as if even this small declaration of personal taste felt daring. It was a tiny step toward reclaiming himself, but it felt monumental in the quiet morning kitchen. Walter hid his smile behind his coffee cup, hope warming his chest more than the hot liquid ever could. The cardboard box made a soft thud as Walter placed it on the kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through the window, highlighting the dust particles that rose from the aged container, dancing in the morning light like tiny stars. The label Adam was written in faded black marker, the edges of the letters softened by time, smudged slightly where fingers had traced them over the years. Adam's eyes fixed on the box, his hands resting flat on the table, fingers spread wide against the worn wood surface. His breathing quickened slightly, but he remained still, like a deer sensing danger in a familiar clearing. "I kept everything," Walter said quietly, his voice gentle, trying to mask the tremor of emotion. "Every report card, every drawing, every certificate." He lifted the lid carefully, revealing stacks of yellowed papers and documents, each one preserved with meticulous care. The musty scent of old paper filled the air between them. Adam's hands twitched, but he didn't reach out. The morning light caught his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw and the uncertainty in his eyes. Papers peeked out from the box, some official-looking documents with government seals, others decorated with childish crayon scribbles in bright primary colors that had faded with the passing years. Slowly, as if moving through water, Adam's hand lifted toward the box. His fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over the papers, casting small shadows on the documents below. Walter remained silent, watching his son's internal struggle play across his face, fighting the urge to reach out and steady those shaking hands. Finally, Adam's fingers closed around the edge of his birth certificate. The paper rustled as he lifted it, holding it like it might crumble in his hands, its edges slightly worn but still intact. His eyes moved across the text, landing on the name printed in bold black letters, stark against the pale paper. "Adam James Grayson," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper, the words catching slightly in his throat. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, fear, confusion, all mixing together in his eyes like colors in a kaleidoscope. Walter leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but steady, careful not to break the fragile moment. "You don't have to be him, but you deserve to know who he was." His hands gripped the edge of the table, anchoring himself. Adam's fingers traced the letters of his name, following each curve and line as if trying to memorize them by touch. His shoulders remained tense, but his breathing had steadied to a more natural rhythm. The morning light caught the edge of the certificate, making the official seal gleam like polished copper. After what felt like an eternity, Adam's lips parted. "Adam," he whispered, testing the name like someone trying on an old piece of clothing, unsure if it still fits. The word felt foreign, yet familiar on his tongue. He didn't embrace it fully, but for the first time he didn't push it away either. The sound of birds chirping outside filled the silence between them, their morning songs drifting through the window. The name hung in the air, neither accepted nor rejected, just acknowledged. A first small step toward something more, like the first ray of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Walter's front porch as he and Adam sat in matching wooden rocking chairs. Birds chirped in the distance, a peaceful sound that seemed at odds with the tension in Adam's shoulders. He gripped the armrests, his knuckles white, the old wood groaning under his desperate grip. "They're going to come for me," Adam murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung heavy in the air between them, like storm clouds threatening rain. Walter turned to look at his son, noting how Adam's eyes constantly scanned the tree line, searching for threats. His gaze darted from shadow to shadow, never resting in one place too long. Years of police work had taught Walter to read people, and everything about Adam's posture screamed fear, from his rigid spine to his shallow breathing. "Tell me about them," Walter said softly, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. He forced himself to remain still, knowing any sudden movement might spook Adam into silence. Adam swallowed hard. "They don't let people leave." "Not really." His hands began to shake, a tremor that seemed to travel up his arms. "I've seen what happens to people who try. They ... He stopped, taking a shaky breath. "They make examples of them." Walter's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, letting Adam continue at his own pace. The gentle creaking of the rocking chairs filled the space between words. "I wasn't supposed to survive," Adam said, his voice cracking. "When they caught me trying to leave the first time, He wrapped his arms around himself, a gesture that made him look young and vulnerable, like the 10-year-old boy he'd been when they took him. "They have people everywhere. In the police, in hospitals, in regular jobs. They watch, they wait, and when someone runs, they bring them back." Walter's police instincts kicked in, cataloging every detail Adam shared. The cult wasn't just a religious group. It was an organized network with deep roots, more dangerous than he'd initially suspected. "How many?" Walter asked quietly, dreading the answer. "Hundreds, maybe thousands." Adam's voice trembled. "They raise children to be loyal, to never question, to dot." He stopped again, his breathing becoming rapid, chest rising and falling in quick succession. "To die for the cause if necessary." Walter reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, before placing a steady hand on Adam's arm. This time, Adam didn't flinch away, though Walter could feel the tension thrumming through his son's muscles. "I won't let them take you," Walter said firmly. "Not again." The promise felt like an oath, carved into his very bones. Adam shook his head, his eyes filling with tears that he refused to let fall. "You don't understand. They never stop. They'll keep coming until..." A flash of movement caught Walter's attention. His eyes narrowed as he spotted a dark sedan parked at the end of the road, its metallic surface gleaming ominously in the late afternoon light. It sat too still, like a predator waiting to strike. The windows were tinted black as pitch, but Walter could feel eyes watching them, calculating, measuring. He stood slowly, his body tensing as decades of law enforcement training kicked in. The car's engine started with a soft purr, and it pulled away unhurried, as if sending a message. "We're here. We're watching. We're patient." Adam had seen it too. His face had gone pale, the color draining away until he looked almost ghostly. His hands were gripping the chair so tight Walter could hear the wood creaking under the pressure. "They found me," Adam whispered, terror evident in every syllable. The words seemed to echo across the porch, carrying the weight of a death sentence. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Walter's living room windows, painting dark stripes across the worn carpet. He stood watch, his weathered face tense as he scanned the street where the suspicious car had been earlier, his jaw clenching and unclenching rhythmically. Behind him, Adam sat hunched on the couch, his fingers twisting together nervously, knuckles white with tension. "We need to be ready," Walter said, keeping his voice calm and steady despite the worry gnawing at his gut. The years of law enforcement experience told him that this quiet moment was just the calm before the storm. Without another word, Walter moved through the house with purpose, his footsteps heavy but measured. He checked each window lock, testing them twice, the metal fixtures clicking reassuringly under his touch. The familiar weight of his old service revolver found its way to his hip holster, a comfort he hadn't needed in years. In the hall closet, he pulled out his shotgun, loading it with practiced efficiency, the shells sliding home with solid clicks. Adam watched silently as Walter worked, his eyes following each movement like a trapped animal tracking potential danger. When Walter pulled out a small security camera from a box of old police equipment, dust motes dancing in the air around it, Adam's breath caught audibly in his throat. "Do you really think they'd come all the way here?" Adam's voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with barely contained fear. Walter paused in mounting the camera near the front window, his hands stilling on the bracket. He turned to meet his son's gaze directly, his expression grave but determined. "I don't think they ever let people go, not really." Adam didn't argue. His shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of this truth settling over him like a heavy blanket. He watched as Walter finished installing the camera, its small red light blinking steadily in the growing shadows. "I should leave," Adam said suddenly, his words tumbling out in a rush of panic. "I'm putting you in danger by staying here. They'll hurt you too." Walter shook his head firmly, his expression hardening. Number running alone is exactly what they want. He sat down across from Adam, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "But I need to know what you want to do, son. We can fight this or we can find somewhere safe for you. But whatever we do it together this time. I'm not losing you again." Adam stared at the floor, the question hanging heavy in the air between them like smoke. His hands trembled slightly as he struggled to find an answer, his breathing shallow and quick. For so long, wanting anything for himself had been forbidden, punishable. Now, faced with a choice, he found himself paralyzed by the weight of it. Walter waited patiently, understanding that for Adam, even having the right to make this decision was overwhelming. The security camera blinked steadily in the growing dusk, a quiet reminder of the danger that might be coming, its red light reflecting faintly off the window glass. "What do you want to do, son?" Walter asked again, gentler this time, his voice soft with concern. Adam lifted his head, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish out of water. For the first time in decades, someone was asking what he wanted, and he had no idea how to answer, the very concept of personal desire foreign and frightening to him. The moonlight filtered through the bedroom window, casting pale shadows across Adam's restless form. He lay rigid on the bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, as his thoughts churned like a violent storm. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. Walter's question from earlier echoed in his mind, each word feeling like a physical weight. "What do you want to do, son?" Want. The word itself felt foreign, dangerous even, like handling a sharp blade he'd never been trained to use. For decades, his life had been a series of commands and expectations. First from Walter, though those memories were hazy and distant, like trying to recall a half-forgotten dream. Then from the cult, where every breath, every movement was dictated by their strict doctrine, where individual desire was considered a poison to be purged. Adam's fingers clutched the bedsheet, twisting the fabric until his knuckles turned white. His chest felt tight, constricted by the weight of choice, as if the very concept of wanting something for himself was slowly suffocating him. The cult leader's voice slithered through his thoughts, as clear as if the man were standing beside him, his cold breath ghosting against Adam's ear. "The outside world will eat you alive, Caleb. They don't understand our way. They'll destroy everything we've built within you. Everything you are belongs to us." But then Walter's gentle words cut through the darkness like a warm ray of sunlight. "You're safe now, son." The sincerity in those words made something deep inside Adam's chest ache with longing. Adam sat up abruptly, his breathing ragged and shallow. He gripped his head between his hands, fingers digging into his scalp, trying to sort through the competing voices that seemed to echo endlessly in his mind. Walter's voice carried warmth, promised safety and acceptance. But the cult leader's words were familiar, had been his reality for so long that they felt carved into his bones. "Who am I supposed to be?" he whispered into the darkness, his voice trembling with uncertainty. The name Adam felt like borrowed clothing, ill-fitting and uncomfortable, like wearing another man's skin. But Caleb now carried the bitter taste of lies and manipulation, a name forced upon him to erase who he'd been before. His feet found the cold floor, the shock of the temperature sending a shiver up his spine. Standing up, Adam moved to the window, watching the empty street below. The night was quiet, almost peaceful, but his mind wouldn't stop racing, thoughts colliding like cars in a crash. What if Walter was wrong? What if there wasn't enough of Adam left to save? The cult had stripped away everything: his memories, his identity, his ability to make even the simplest choices, like layers of paint scraped from a wall until nothing remained but bare surface. How could he possibly know who he really was anymore? Unable to bear the confines of the room, which seemed to grow smaller with each passing moment, Adam slipped out into the hallway. His footsteps were silent, a habit ingrained by years of strict discipline where the slightest sound could bring severe punishment. He made his way downstairs and out onto the front porch, each step careful and measured. The cool night air hit his face like a gentle slap, but it didn't calm the storm in his mind. From where he stood, he could see the road stretching out into darkness, disappearing into the unknown like a river flowing into shadow. It would be so easy to just start walking, to disappear into that darkness. Not because Walter scared him. No. Walter was the first person in decades to show him real kindness, to look at him like he was more than just an empty vessel to be filled with someone else's beliefs. He was scared of himself, scared of the broken pieces he'd have to sort through, like shards of a mirror that might cut him as he tried to piece them back together. Scared of making the wrong choice, scared of making any choice at all when choice itself felt like a foreign language he'd never learned to speak. The road beckoned, offering the familiar comfort of running away, of not having to face the overwhelming task ahead. It would be simpler than facing the daunting task of rebuilding himself from scattered fragments of memory and identity, easier than trying to remember who Adam Grayson had been before he became Caleb. Adam stood there, frozen between staying and fleeing, between Adam and Caleb, between past and present, his bare feet rooted to the wooden boards of the porch. For the first time in his life, the choice was entirely his. And that was the most terrifying thing of all, like standing on the edge of a cliff with no idea what waited at the bottom. The floorboards creaked under Walter's feet as he moved through the darkened house, his instincts on high alert. Something felt wrong. The silence was too thick, too heavy, like a wool blanket draped over his senses. His hand automatically reached for the shotgun he'd placed near the door, his fingers wrapping around the familiar wooden stock. Then he heard it. The soft scuff of shoes on gravel outside, followed by the whisper of movement through grass. Walter eased open the front door, his breath catching at the sight before him. Adam stood motionless in the front yard, still wearing the clothes he'd gone to bed in, thin cotton pajamas that seemed inadequate against the night air. His bare feet pressed into the cool grass, his eyes fixed on something down the road. Following his gaze, Walter spotted it. A black sedan parked at the edge of his property, its headlights dark and engine silent, a predator waiting in the shadows. Walter moved deliberately, positioning himself between Adam and the car. The shotgun felt solid in his hands, a reminder that this time, he wouldn't let anyone take his son. His jaw clenched as memories of that long-ago failure threatened to surface. The car door opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the night. A man in an immaculate dark suit stepped out, his movements precise and unhurried, like a conductor preparing to lead an orchestra. Despite Walter's protective stance and raised weapon, the man's attention focused solely on Adam, as if Walter were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "It's time to come home," he said, his voice gentle but carrying an undercurrent of steel, like silk wrapped around a blade. Walter's finger tightened on the trigger. "He is home." The words came out as a low growl, heavy with 30 years of regret and determination. The man, Mr. Hale, Walter assumed from Adam's previous descriptions, finally turned his gaze to Walter. His smile was pleasant, almost kind, making it all the more unsettling. There was something empty behind his eyes, like looking into a deep well. "Sheriff Grayson," he acknowledged with a slight nod. You've done an admirable job caring for our brother, but he was never yours to keep. Some bonds run deeper than blood." Behind Walter, Adam made a small, choked sound. Walter could feel him trembling, could sense the years of conditioning threatening to pull his son back into darkness. "Get back in your car," Walter growled, "before I give you a reason to." His finger caressed the trigger, the promise of violence clear in his stance. Mr. Hale's smile never wavered. "The truth has a way of pulling people back, Sheriff." He turned, sliding back into the sedan with fluid grace, like water flowing downhill. The engine purred to life, and the car reversed slowly before disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind only the lingering sense of a promise, or perhaps a threat. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily as Walter paced back and forth across the worn living room carpet, its ancient mechanism marking each second with meticulous precision. His jaw was clenched tight, hands balled into fists at his sides, knuckles white with tension. Every few steps he'd glance out the window, scanning the darkness beyond, searching for threats both real and imagined. Adam sat motionless on the couch, his shoulders hunched, staring down at his trembling hands as if they belonged to someone else. The moonlight filtering through the thin curtains cast strange shadows across his face, making him look even more lost and vulnerable, like a child trapped in a man's body. Finally, Walter stopped his pacing, the sudden stillness almost jarring. The floorboards creaked under his feet as he turned to face his son, each sound echoing in the tense silence. His voice was gentle but firm when he spoke, carefully measured to avoid startling the fragile peace between them. "I can protect you, but only if you want to be here." Adam flinched at the words, his shoulders tensing even more, drawing inward like a turtle retreating into its shell. The concept of choice was foreign to him, dangerous even. In the cult, choices weren't allowed. Everything was decided for him, down to when he could eat or sleep. Walter's expression softened as he watched Adam struggle, recognizing the internal battle raging behind those haunted eyes. He moved closer, but not too close, giving his son space to breathe, treating him with the same careful consideration he'd use with a wounded animal. "I can't force you to stay, son, but I need to know, do you want to be Adam Grayson, or do you want to be the person they made you?" The question hung heavy in the air like storm clouds before rain. Adam's breathing quickened, his hands gripping the fabric of his pants until his knuckles turned white. For the first time in decades, someone was giving him control over his own life. The weight of it was overwhelming, pressing down on him like a physical force. Minutes passed in silence, marked only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. Walter waited patiently, his heart pounding but his exterior calm, years of law enforcement training helping him maintain his composure. He knew this moment would define everything that came after, would set the course for whatever future they might build together. Finally, Adam raised his head. His eyes, usually distant and guarded like frosted glass, met Walter's directly. His voice was barely above a whisper but steady, carrying the weight of conviction. "I want to be Adam." Walter let out a shaky breath, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes, years of contained emotion threatening to spill over. His son had chosen him, had chosen himself, had taken the first step toward reclaiming the life that was stolen from him so long ago. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow across the worn linoleum floor. Adam stood in the doorway for a moment, his bare feet cold against the tiles, fingers curled around the wooden frame. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, rich and inviting, and Walter sat at the table, rustling through yesterday's newspaper, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. Something felt different today. The name Caleb seemed distant now, like an old coat he'd finally shed, a memory growing fainter with each passing hour. Each step into the kitchen felt more natural, more his own, as if his feet were remembering a path they'd walked long ago. Walter glanced up briefly, then back down at his paper, pretending to focus on the headlines. He'd learned not to push, not to make every moment heavy with expectation. The coffee maker gurgled softly in the background, a steady, comforting rhythm. "Good morning," Adam said quietly. the words coming out before he could overthink them, surprising himself with their ease. Walter's hand stilled on the newspaper, but he kept his response casual, fighting to contain his joy at this small victory. Morning. He reached for the coffee pot, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Want some? Adam nodded and sat down at the table, the chair creaking softly beneath him. A plate of toast already waited there, butter melting into the warm bread, and he began eating without the usual hesitation. The simple act of choosing when to speak, when to eat, it felt foreign but right, like rediscovering something long forgotten. As he lifted his coffee cup, he noticed his hands trembling slightly. The hot liquid rippled, creating tiny waves against the ceramic sides, and reality crashed back in. Choosing to be Adam Grayson was one thing. Erasing 30 years of conditioning was another. The cult's voices still echoed in his head, softer now but still present, like whispers in a distant room. Walter noticed the shaking but said nothing, his weathered face carefully neutral. He just slid the sugar bowl closer, giving Adam the space to steady himself. They sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds being the clink of cups and the rustle of newspaper pages, morning light growing stronger through the windows. After a while, Adam set down his cup, the ceramic making a soft tap against the table. His voice was hesitant but clear, carrying a weight of curiosity he'd never allowed himself before. What was I like? Before? Walter lowered his paper, a small smile tugging at his lips, his eyes brightening with memories and hope. His son was finally ready to know himself, to reclaim the boy he'd once been. The morning sun cast long shadows across Walter's front porch as father and son sat in matching wooden chairs. Adam's fingers drummed against the armrest, his eyes scanning the tree line with practiced vigilance. The quiet felt heavy, loaded with unspoken tension, broken only by the distant call of birds and the soft creak of wood beneath them. "They'll be back," Adam finally said, his voice steady but quiet, almost resigned to the inevitability of it. Walter nodded, his jaw set firm. "I know." He stood up, checking the new security camera he'd mounted above the porch, adjusting its angle slightly. "But this time we'll be ready." Inside, Walter moved with purpose, checking each window lock methodically, testing the frames. Adam followed, watching his movements before stepping in to help. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he tested the back door's deadbolt, then double-checked the frame for weak points. "You know what you're doing," Walter observed, noting how Adam's movements were precise, almost military in their execution. He couldn't help but wonder how many times his son had performed similar security checks. Adam's lips tightened. "They taught us survival skills, security protocols." His voice was flat, but his eyes showed a flash of something else, determination rather than fear. His fingers traced the edge of the doorframe with knowing precision. Walter pulled out his shotgun, checking the chamber with a familiar click. Those skills might come in handy now. Adam nodded, then moved to the windows, analyzing sight lines and potential entry points. His movements were controlled, careful, nothing like the frightened man who'd tried to run away days before. He paused at the kitchen window, studying it intently. "This is vulnerable. We should board it up." Walter watched his son work, realizing that the very training meant to keep Adam trapped might now help save him. There was a bitter irony in that, but he'd take any advantage they could get. Every skill they'd forced on his son would become a weapon against them. They spent the next hour reinforcing weak points, setting up emergency lights, creating defensive positions. Adam moved like a tactician, thinking 3 steps ahead, placing supplies at strategic points throughout the house. This wasn't blind panic anymore, this was strategy, born from years of harsh training. As they finished securing the last window, Adam turned to Walter. His eyes were clear, focused, carrying a weight that seemed beyond his years. "How far are you willing to go to keep me here?" Walter met his son's gaze without hesitation, years of determination evident in his weathered face. "As far as I have to." The words hung in the air between them, a promise and a warning all at once, sealed by the growing shadows of late afternoon. The night wrapped around Walter's house like a heavy blanket, the silence broken only by the soft hum of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves in the cool breeze. Walter sat by the front window, his weathered hands resting on the shotgun laid across the kitchen table, its metal catching glints of lamplight. Every few minutes, his eyes scanned the darkness beyond the porch light's reach, searching for any sign of movement in the shadows. Adam paced quietly behind him, his movements controlled and precise, each step carefully placed as if he'd been trained to move without sound. He'd changed in the past few days. There was a steadiness to him now, a quiet determination that had replaced his earlier fear. His shoulders were straighter, his chin held higher. The distant gleam of headlights caught Walter's attention. A black car crawled down the road, its engine barely audible, tires crunching softly on the gravel. Walter's grip tightened on his gun, his knuckles turning white. "They're here," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Adam moved to stand behind his father, his breathing even and controlled, showing none of the terror that had marked his earlier days. "I know." Walter rose and opened the front door before they could even step onto the porch, the hinges creaking softly in protest. The black car's doors opened smoothly, and Mr. Hale emerged, his suit pristine even in the darkness, not a wrinkle in sight. 3 other men stepped out behind him, their faces blank masks, moving with military precision. "Sheriff!" Mr. Hale's voice carried across the yard, smooth as silk but edged with steel, each word carefully chosen. "You've had your fun playing house. It's time for him to come home." Walter's finger rested near the trigger, but he kept the gun pointed down, years of police training evident in his stance. "He is home." Mr. Hale's smile didn't reach his eyes, creating an unsettling contrast with his pleasant tone. "Come now. We both know that's not true. Caleb belongs with us, with his real family." Adam stepped forward, moving to stand beside Walter, shoulder to shoulder. His voice, when it came, was steady and clear, carrying the weight of newfound conviction. "This is home." He met Mr. Hale's gaze without flinching, something that would have been impossible just days ago. "And my name is Adam." Something flickered across Mr. Hale's face. Surprise, perhaps, or anger. It vanished quickly beneath his practiced smile, like ripples smoothing on a pond. "You've confused him, Sheriff, made him forget who he really is." "No," Adam said, his voice stronger now, gaining confidence with each word. "You're the ones who made me forget, but I remember now. I remember everything." Mr. Hale's smile finally faded, replaced by something cold and hard, a mask slipping to reveal the predator beneath. He gave a slight nod to the men behind him. They began to spread out, moving with practiced efficiency, taking positions that Walter recognized all too well from his years in law enforcement. "I had hoped to handle this civilly," Mr. Hale said, straightening his tie with deliberate slowness. "But you leave me no choice." He raised his hand, and his men reached into their jackets, their movements synchronized. Walter raised his shotgun, the familiar weight steady in his hands. "That's far enough." The night air crackled with tension as both sides stood their ground, waiting to see who would make the first move. Crickets fell silent, as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation of what would come next. The first blow came without warning. One of Mr. Hale's men lunged at Adam, aiming for a quick takedown. But Adam wasn't the same person they'd known in the cult. His body reacted instinctively, muscle memory from years of rigorous combat training taking over. He sidestepped the attack with lightning-fast reflexes, grabbing the man's arm and using his own momentum against him. The attacker hit the ground hard, the air rushing out of his lungs in a pained gasp. Walter raised his shotgun and fired into the night sky, the thunderous blast echoing through the quiet neighborhood. "Next one won't be a warning shot," he growled, his gruff voice laced with a protective fury. 2 more men rushed forward, determined to subdue Adam and reclaim their lost asset. But Adam moved with precise, controlled movements, blocking strikes, retaliating with calculated strikes of his own, and defending against their advances. Years of the cult's ruthless combat training now served a different purpose, protecting his hard-won freedom rather than enforcing their twisted control. Walter kept his shotgun trained on Mr. Hale, who stood watching the scene unfold with an unsettling, eerily calm demeanor. One of the attackers pulled a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. Adam disarmed him in seconds, twisting the man's wrist until the weapon fell to the grass. "You taught me too well," Adam said, his voice steady and unwavering as he faced down his former captors. Mr. Hale's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. He watched with growing unease as his men struggled against Adam's skilled, relentless defense. When the third attacker went down, clutching his knee in pain, Mr. Hale raised his hand. "Enough," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument. His men backed away, breathing heavily from the exertion of the failed assault. Walter kept his shotgun raised, his finger steady on the trigger. "Get off my property," he growled, the protective instinct to shield Adam from further harm evident in every word. Mr. Hale straightened his tie, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve with a practiced, condescending gesture. His smile was cold and calculating. "You think this is over?" he asked, his voice dripping with menace. Walter stepped forward, his grip on the shotgun tightening. "I know it is," he replied, his unwavering certainty a challenge to the cult leader's arrogance. The cult leader's men limped back to the car, their pride and confidence shattered by their unexpected defeat. Mr. Hale followed, sliding into the back seat with practiced grace. The black car pulled away, leaving Adam and Walter standing together in the yard, united and victorious in their defiance of the cult's relentless pursuit. The living room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the old wall clock. Adam sat in the armchair, his knuckles bruised and swollen from the fight, small droplets of blood still drying on his skin. Walter settled into his usual spot on the couch, still gripping his shotgun like a lifeline, his weathered fingers wrapped tightly around the worn wood. Neither spoke for several long minutes, both processing what had just happened in the front yard, the echo of violence still hanging in the air. Adam's gaze drifted to his hands, turning them over slowly in the dim light. These same hands had fought back tonight, not for the cult, but for himself, for his freedom, for his real identity. For the first time in decades, they had served his own will, not theirs. Standing suddenly, Adam moved with purpose toward the guest room that had become his temporary sanctuary, his footsteps quiet but determined on the old floorboards. Walter watched silently as his son disappeared down the hallway, fighting the urge to follow. Inside the room, Adam opened the closet door slowly, the hinges creaking softly. There, hanging neatly, were the clothes he'd arrived in, plain, dark garments that marked him as property of the cult, each fold and seam a reminder of his captivity. He gathered them in his arms, feeling the rough fabric one last time, remembering the weight of submission they represented. Walking back through the living room, Adam headed for the back door, his stride unwavering. Walter rose to follow, understanding without words that this moment mattered, that something profound was about to unfold. In the backyard, beneath the vast star-filled sky, Adam arranged the clothes in a neat pile on the ground. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, like a priest preparing for a sacred ritual. Walter stood a few feet away, giving his son space but remaining close enough to show support, his presence steady and reassuring. Adam pulled out a matchbox from his pocket, the cardboard worn soft from being carried. His hands were steady now as he struck the match, the sharp scratch breaking the night's silence. The small flame flickered in the night air, casting dancing shadows across his face. He held it for a moment, staring at the clothes that had defined him for so long, that had bound him to a life that was never truly his. "These aren't me anymore," Adam said softly, his voice carrying the weight of decades, then dropped the match. The flames caught quickly, spreading across the fabric like eager fingers. Orange light danced across Adam's face as he watched his past burn away, highlighting the determination in his features. The fire grew stronger, consuming everything that had marked him as Caleb, turning his prison uniform into ash and smoke. Walter stood quietly beside his son, watching the transformation happen, feeling the heat of the flames on his skin. The flames reflected in both their eyes as they witnessed the last physical ties to the cult turn to ash, years of captivity dissolving in the fire's hungry embrace. Adam's voice was barely a whisper when he spoke, carried on the smoke rising into the darkness. "Goodbye, Caleb." The fire crackled and popped, sending bright sparks into the night sky like fleeing memories. When the flames began to die down, leaving only glowing embers, Adam turned to face his father. His eyes were clear and determined, shining with a new strength. "My name is Adam Grayson," he said firmly, claiming his identity at last, each word a declaration of freedom. Walter's throat tightened with emotion, but he managed to nod, his eyes glistening in the firelight. "Yeah, son, it is." The morning sun streamed through the police station windows as Walter and Adam walked through the familiar glass doors. The front desk area was quiet, with only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the clicking of computer keyboards filling the air. A coffee mug left rings on the worn counter, and the faint scent of paper and ink hung in the air. Officer Dan Parker looked up from his paperwork, his eyes widening in recognition. "You okay, kid?" Dan asked, his voice gentle but uncertain. He straightened in his chair, remembering the night Adam had escaped. How different he'd seemed then, like a trapped animal, wild-eyed and trembling. Adam met his gaze steadily, something new in his eyes. The fear that had haunted him before was replaced with quiet determination. "Yeah, I think I am." Walter stood close to his son, protective but not hovering. His hand twitched at his side, ready to offer support if needed. They'd come prepared with a stack of documents, birth certificates, old school records, newspaper clippings, everything that proved Adam Grayson had existed before the cult took him. The chief of police, a stern-faced man with graying hair and deep laugh lines around his mouth, led them to his office. The walls were lined with commendations and old photographs, telling stories of decades of service. A small American flag stood in the corner. He gestured for them to sit in the worn leather chairs across from his desk. "This is a unique situation," the chief said, spreading the paperwork before them. His weathered hands smoothed each page with careful precision. "We'll need to process everything carefully." He looked directly at Adam, his expression serious but kind. "Do you understand what this means?" Adam sat up straighter, his shoulders squared. "Yes, I do." His voice was clear, confident, no trace of the hesitation that had marked his speech weeks before. They took his fingerprints, comparing them to the records from 30 years ago. The computer beeped its confirmation, a perfect match. The chief nodded, satisfied, and made a note in the file. One by one, Adam signed the documents. Each signature was like another brick in the foundation of his reclaimed identity, each stroke of the pen bringing him closer to who he truly was. Walter watched, his chest tight with pride and his eyes slightly misty, as his son methodically worked through the paperwork. Officer Parker brought in the final forms, setting them carefully on the desk. The manila folder was thick with official stamps and seals. He'd been skeptical at first, but seeing Adam now, calm, determined, present, was all the confirmation he needed. As Adam signed the last document with a steady hand, Walter placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth and solidity beneath his palm. "You're home now, son." Adam looked up at his father, a hint of a smile touching his lips, no hesitation in his voice. "Yeah, I am." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Margaret's front yard as Walter and Adam stood before the small white house. The garden was well tended, with bright flowers lining the walkway and butterflies fluttering between the blooms. Adam's hands trembled slightly at his sides and he shifted his weight from foot to foot, his shoulders tense beneath his worn jacket. "We don't have to do this today," Walter said softly, noticing his son's unease. His weathered face was etched with concern as he watched Adam struggle. Adam shook his head. "No, I need to." His voice was quiet but determined. He'd faced down cult members, reclaimed his identity, but this felt different, more intimate, more frightening somehow. This was about who he had been before everything was taken from him. Walter knocked on the door. The sound seemed to echo in Adam's chest like a drumbeat. Footsteps approached from inside, growing closer with each passing second, and Adam held his breath, fighting the urge to retreat. The door opened slowly, hinges creaking softly. Margaret stood there, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, a few loose strands framing her face. She wore a simple blue dress with tiny white flowers, and her hands flew to her mouth when she saw them. Her eyes, so like Adam's, filled with tears immediately, decades of grief and hope spilling over at once. "Adam?" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with emotion, filled with disbelief and longing. Adam nodded, unable to speak. Something stirred in his chest, a feeling he couldn't name, but it felt real. Not manufactured, not programmed. Real, like a seed breaking through soil toward sunlight. Margaret's hands shook as she invited them inside, stepping back to make way. The living room was cozy, filled with soft furniture and family photos on every wall and surface. Adam's gaze caught on one, a little boy with his mother's eyes laughing at the camera, gap-toothed and carefree in a way he barely remembered being. They sat together, the air thick with unspoken words and shared pain. Margaret couldn't stop looking at her son, drinking in every detail of his face as if memorizing him all over again. Adam sat stiffly on the floral-patterned couch, but he didn't pull away when she hesitantly reached for his hand, her touch gentle and warm. I'll make some tea," Walter offered, giving them space. His footsteps retreated toward the kitchen, leaving mother and son alone with their shared history. Margaret suddenly stood, moving to a cabinet in the corner. "Wait," she said. "I want to show you something." She pulled out a small, carefully folded quilt that had clearly been treasured. The fabric was worn soft with age, the colors still bright, blues and greens in a simple pattern that somehow felt familiar. "I made this for you," she said softly, holding it out to Adam. "When you were just a baby. I worked on it every night while you slept in your crib." Adam reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric. Suddenly, a memory washed over him. Not painful like the others, not forced or traumatic. Just warm. Safe. The smell of lavender and the soft weight of this quilt, his mother's humming as she tucked him in, the gentle press of her lips against his forehead. Tears spilled down his cheeks, but for once he didn't try to hide them. He didn't run. He stayed, holding the quilt that connected him to a past he was finally beginning to remember, each stitch a thread leading him home. Margaret sat beside him, close enough to feel his warmth but not so close as to overwhelm him, her own tears falling freely. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The quilt between them said everything words couldn't, bridging the years of separation with love that had never died. The morning mist hung low over the lake, creating a dreamlike atmosphere as Walter and Adam made their way down the old wooden dock. Their footsteps echoed across the weathered planks, a rhythmic sound that brought back memories of simpler times. Small waves lapped gently against the support beams below, adding their quiet melody to the morning symphony. Walter carried 2 fishing rods and a small tackle box, while Adam held a thermos of hot coffee. The sunrise painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, reflecting off the still water like a mirror. A pair of ducks glided silently across the glassy surface, leaving gentle ripples in their wake. "Used to come here every Sunday," Walter said softly, settling into his familiar spot at the edge of the dock. He handed Adam one of the fishing rods, his movements careful and deliberate, as if handling something precious. Adam took it, his movements more natural now, less rigid than before. He sat down beside his father, letting his feet dangle over the water. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and lake water. A light breeze ruffled his hair, and for once he didn't flinch at the unexpected touch. "I remember," Adam said quietly, surprising both of them. Not everything, but pieces. The smell of the water, the sound of the birds. His voice carried a hint of wonder, like someone discovering a long-lost treasure. Walter's hands stilled as he baited his hook. He glanced at his son, careful not to make too much of the admission. "Yeah, you always loved it out here." His voice was gruff with emotion he couldn't quite hide. They cast their lines in comfortable silence, watching the ripples spread across the glassy surface. The sun continued its ascent, warming their faces. Adam closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. For the first time in decades, his shoulders relaxed completely. The constant tension that had been his companion for so long melted away in the morning light. Walter watched him from the corner of his eye, noting the peace that seemed to settle over his son. After a while, he cleared his throat. "So, what's next for you?" The question hung in the air, gentle and undemanding. Adam smiled softly, shaking his head. "I don't know." The admission didn't frighten him anymore. There was something freeing about the uncertainty. His fingers traced absent patterns on the fishing rod handle. Walter grinned, reeling in his line a bit. "That's the best part. You get to decide." He adjusted his cap, hiding the moisture gathering in his eyes. Adam considered this, watching his bobber float gently on the water. The concept of choice, real choice, was still new to him, but it no longer felt overwhelming. It felt like possibility, like hope taking wing. The morning light caught the water droplets falling from their fishing lines, creating tiny rainbows. Birds called to each other across the lake, their songs echoing off the surrounding trees. It was perfect in its simplicity. A gentle mist rose from the water's surface, dancing in the strengthening sunlight. Adam cast his line again, and this time a genuine smile spread across his face. The weight of his past, the years of control, fear, and loss, seemed to lift from his shoulders, carried away by the gentle morning breeze. His movements were smooth and confident, muscle memory from long-ago mornings returning naturally. They sat there, father and son, as the sun continued to rise before them. No words were needed. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding and the promise of tomorrow. The lake stretched before them like an open road, full of possibilities yet to be discovered. If you enjoyed the story of Walter, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.